Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anthropuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we're pleased to have Daniel Ginsberg with us. Daniel is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the American Anthropological Association, where they help shape the organization's vision and strategic goals. Their journey has taken them through a variety of roles, from a high school ESL teacher to a language assessment developer and education researcher. They've also worked as a program manager/service designer, combining their expertise in education and social linguistics. How are you doing today, Daniel?
All right. How are you?
I'm doing well. So let's get into this. What exactly is the American Anthropological Association?
So we are a professional association of anthropologists. A lot of professions have them. I'm a member of the American Society of Association Executives, where people who work for associations come together for professional development and networking. And the association where I work does similar kind of things for anthropologists. And so it might be familiar if you've thought about the AAA annual meeting. We have a big meeting every year, a conference that probably our most high profile event that a lot of people join so that they can present at our meeting. We also publish about 24 journals. We offer different kinds of networking opportunities throughout the year, some programming for college students and high school students. And we also promote anthropology with the general public and media, just to try and help people outside of the discipline understand what anthropologists do.
And for those who didn't know, the American Anthropological Association's annual meeting is actually happening November 20th through 23rd of 2024. And anthropologists will be coming from around the world to gather in Tampa, as well as online for this meeting. And whether you're presenting your research or you're learning about new developments in your specialty, this is the place to grow as an anthropologist. So if you'd like to register, you can do so by going to the association's website at americananthro.org. Okay, yeah, and that's super important because most people I talk to, when I mention that I have an anthropology degree, they're like, what exactly is that? So it's not something that's very well known. I didn't learn about it until I was picking a humanities course at my university. And so as the Director of Strategic Initiatives, what exactly does that job entail?
It's a new thing for me. I've worked at the AAA since 2016, but this Director of Strategic Initiatives is a new role for me as of January of this year. We're recording in 2024 for any future listeners. And so mainly what I work on is trying to think about where we want the association to go in the sort of mid to long range future and how we set ourselves up structurally to be able to get there. So what that means practically is things like thinking about how the association is run. We have an executive board of 18 anthropologists who are elected by the membership to run the sort of strategy and mission of the association and very high level things about where are we going and what kind of things do we want to be doing. And so part of my work is thinking about how that group of people might function better to serve the association and the membership and take us where we need to be going. And I work on advocacy. So thinking about how, I mentioned how anthropology is presented to the general public, how we choose to get involved or not get involved in different sorts of issues as they come up, and how we sort of take the case to people within the discipline and also outside of it to remind them that what we do really matters, and have different kinds of offerings that we can have to bring that point home.
Okay. And how did you get into that? Because I see you've held a variety of different jobs. What kind of did you do in your early life that led to this point?
Okay. Yeah. I could tell the story forward or I could tell the story backward. But forward is good. So, in college, I was trying to double major in comparative literature and math because I think that STEM versus the humanities is a fake idea. I think it's a conflict. It's like kayfabe, right? In professional wrestling, something to generate a lot of heat and attention. But really, I think that, I was really interested in math and I was really interested in world literature and languages. And my senior year, I took my first linguistics course and I was like, oh, language, but also science. This is what I should have been doing all along. Too bad I just discovered it now. But I was also volunteering, teaching English as a second language as a sort of extracurricular activity. And I decided that was what I wanted to do. So when I graduated, I went and got my master's in teaching ESL. I taught in a variety of different settings over the next 6 years. And in the final setting, I was teaching in a public high school outside of Boston. And I was teaching math to English learners. And the course that I was meant to be offering was to help them learn, whatever their grade level math was, and also learn English at the same time. by teaching math in English in such a way that you can also learn English from it. And it's a pretty common approach in places where you can't do bilingual education and actually teach the material in the students' native language while they're learning English. There's a lot of reasons why you might not be able to do that. For example, in my classroom, I had so many different native languages and I didn't know hardly any of them. So that's what I was trying to do. And I was trying to think about like, what is the language that you need to be able to learn Algebra 1, Algebra 2? And nobody could really help me with that. And so long story short, what ended up happening was I went back to grad school and I wrote my PhD dissertation on a related question to that about how communication happens in mathematics classrooms. And that was how I got into anthropology, because like within the field of linguistics, as the former classroom teacher, the style of engagement and research that felt most relatable to me, it wasn't like a psychological kind of a thing where you might have like a pretest of a large number of students, and then you do a sample lesson, and then you do a post-test, and then you do statistics and see what made the scores go up. Like for me, that was not so relatable. It was more like I want to see the same kids every single day because that's what I know from teaching. And that looks like ethnography. And so that's how, kind of similar to how my senior year of college, I learned about linguistics. It was probably my fourth year of my PhD program that I learned about anthropology.
Oh, wow.
So I finished with my degree in linguistics, but I went to work for the Anthropological Association because another thing that I was really interested in that time was trying to help doc students see more different professional opportunities for themselves beyond just like, obviously, you're going to be a professor and look for a tenure track job. There was a lot of reasons why I decided I didn't want that. And what I ended up doing was finding a job for myself where I could promote that message of, you have this training and you could do a lot of things with it. And then since then, that's over the last 8 years, I've worked at the association. I went from that kind of role where I started off doing more research about the profession. What do anthropologists do? Where do they work? Where do they study? What schools grant degrees and what kind of jobs do people go on to? I went from there sort of into education programming. And I was the director of education and professional practice from 2020 to 23. And then I made another shift at the beginning of this year. And now we're all caught up.
Yeah, it's definitely not like a linear path. And what's important to notate is there is a difference between regular linguistics and linguistic anthropology. And they have a lot of crossover because, you're studying language and whatnot. But you having a degree in social linguistics, I felt was important. Like, even though it wasn't technically like anthropology, I felt it was important because you were also working with all of these different kinds of anthropologists in all the different career fields that they have. So it's very important insight that like, even though you may not have an anthropology degree, you can still work with a lot of anthropologists, and kind of understand what is it they do and, why are they important to the field that you're in.
I feel like sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology, also sociology of language, it's kind of three names for the same thing.
Right.
The difference for me in my graduate program was I didn't have to take classes in archaeology and biological anthropology. I had to take classes in syntax and phonology and language acquisition.
Wow. Yeah. I think my business in writing class was the hardest one I had to take because it's like English grammar and it was not clicking for me. And I'm like, I can't do that. But that is amazing.
The key thing, the difference there is have colleagues I think I've seen from the Lingthusiasm podcast. They sell merch that says not judging your grammar, just analyzing it.
That is so cool. That's a great sticker slogan. So let's talk a little bit about your grad school experience. Like, what was that like? The application process, your advisors, writing a thesis and dissertation. So
because I had such a nonlinear career path, I don't know how much my story like serves as advice for anyone. I want to say that as a caveat, really just because, if it's just my story and it sort of happened the way it happened because I was where I was doing what I was doing. And I made so many mistakes. I would say, you have to start with me being a career changer. I had been 6 or 7 years out of my MA in a different field, following a BA in another different field when I went back to apply to grad school. So I didn't know one grad program from another. I had this like random list of schools that I was applying to because like they sounded like good schools and they had linguistics. And then we ended up moving to Washington, D.C. for my spouse's work. And so all of that went out the window and it was like, okay, is there a school in D.C. that I could go to because of the two-body problem? And I applied to Georgetown University and I got rejected. And I applied again the following year and I got in. And there's a lot of different reasons why that might have happened the way it did. I think part of the reason is that I was so naive, Abby. The first year that I applied, one of my letters of reference came from the teacher who had been my mentor teacher in the new teacher orientation in a high school where I taught. Because I thought, she knows me really well and can talk about what a hard worker and a smart person I am. Mm-hmm. Turns out graduate admissions committees do not care about the opinion of some random high school teacher. That's not the game that they are playing. It's the game that I was playing, but it's like you don't get up to bat in a baseball game and try and score a touchdown, right? So you can't win by playing a different game. So what I ended up doing is in the intervening year, this was what you mentioned in the introduction, that I worked in language testing. I was working at the Center for Applied Linguistics in between the first time I applied and the second time I applied. And I got my boss's boss at the Center for Applied Linguistics to write my letter the second time around. And he had a fancy title and he had a PhD and people were familiar with the Center for Applied Linguistics. And I think that might have, I don't know if it made the difference. I also wrote a new personal statement. But, it's such a crapshoot also because it might have just depended on like who else applied that year versus who else applied the first time, right? Because it's so many slots they have available. Right. I would say applying to grad school, if you're coming out of an undergrad program and thinking about applying to PhDs, MAs are different. But if you're thinking about applying to PhDs, it's almost less like applying for a school and more like applying for a job. And, you also asked me about my experience in grad school. One thing that I realized is as a PhD student, and especially once you finish all your coursework and have a dissertation proposal approved and are what's called a PhD candidate, that's not learning how to do an academic job. That already is an academic job. You're teaching, you're doing research, you might be involved in student government or programs, or I was involved in the student leadership of another different association. So that's service that professors talk about, doing research, teaching, and service. You're doing all of those things and you're getting paid by the university. So you're already doing an academic job. It's just an academic job with no possibility of promotion and starvation wages that you sort of tread water until you defend your dissertation and then go off and hopefully find something cool to do with yourself.
That just boggles my mind that that's even allowed for students. It's almost like the university knows like, hey, I know you need to get this degree and I know you're paying a crap ton of money for it. So we're just going to give you this little stipend on the end and maybe it'll make things okay. That just blows my mind.
Yeah.
Speaking of making money, for nonprofit positions, what has been your take or what have you noticed regarding like the average salary pay for nonprofits?
So I've worked for a bunch of different nonprofits. My first job out of my MA, I was teaching English part-time at a community-based organization. It was basically with like working adults in the neighborhood who were learning English as a second language, like evenings and weekends. And that was an hourly rate. And it was not a great hourly rate, especially if you factor in prep time. But it was sort of similar to how people talk about adjunct faculty, where it's really difficult to like figure out how to transition from that into a full-time job. When I was at the Center for Applied Linguistics, I don't remember how much money I made. I worked there from 2009 to 2011-12. It was a professional salary. I don't remember exactly how much. When I started at AAA, I guess I was right out of a PhD program. So maybe the comparable thing would be to compare me to junior faculty, like a new assistant professor, or to like, I was a postdoc when I started. So if you look at NSF postdoc grants, it tends to be like in the low 60,000s. And I was sort of in that ballpark when I started as well, maybe a little bit below it. And now, now I make $100,000 with a director title and close to a decade of experience in this industry. Plus a lot of the work that I do is related to education. And I have that background of being a teacher and being involved in higher ed in various ways. I would make more if I went to the federal government. I would make more than that if I went to the private sector, but it's, reasonable for where I live.
With nonprofits, I know it's a little bit harder to make a higher salary just because of the work they're doing. You kind of have to love the work that you're doing, not so much doing it for the money. That is a part, but doing it because you love what you do and being okay with saying like, oh, I could be making double what I'm making now if I just went to the private sector, but I love what I'm doing here and how I'm contributing to this organization. Yeah. That makes it worth it.
I honestly think that anthropology tends to attract people with that kind of orientation because there's not really a job that you can get that's called like, I am an anthropologist. Right. It's not my job title. And so you don't study anthropology because you're preparing for an anthropology job. You study anthropology. There's a lot of different reasons. Why did you study anthropology?
I studied anthropology. One was because my business classes were so boring and I needed something to spice them up. So I was taking like, forensic anthropology or shipwreck archaeology. So that just made it a whole lot better. And I think what contributed to that is I studied abroad in Switzerland for 6 months during my undergraduate degree. And, just being able to immerse myself in a different culture and, the people and the food and the traditions that they had, I'm just like, this is so cool. I feel like everyone should do this. And at the time, my anthropology major was a minor. And so when I got back to the United States, I'm like, might as well make it a major because I had most of my credits for my AA already through high school. So it wasn't going to cost me more time to get the major, and a lot of my classes kind of overlapped as well, credit-wise. But I just enjoy learning about the different cultures, being able to tie that into the places that I've been. Like, I've been to Mexico and I've seen Chichen Itza, and that was super cool. And I'm hoping, to go to like Egypt next year, or maybe to see the pyramids, or Peru to see like Machu Picchu. So just being able to tie in what I have learned through my schooling, or just like watching documentaries on Netflix or Disney Plus, it's just enjoyable to me. Like, even if I can't make it like a career out of it, at least it's something that I'm always going to be learning no matter what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, right? You put your finger on it, where people come into it with this feeling of, on the first hand, like other people around the world and throughout human history are so different from me in ways that I never even imagined were possible. And that blows my mind. How can I learn more? And like, what are the things that I can materially do to learn more? That's a really exciting question for a lot of people. And then the second piece of it is like, now that I understand this, what does it tell me about how I should be in the world? What are my ethical, moral obligations, recognizing that I'm no better than anyone else just by virtue of like being born where I was born? And there are jobs that care about those things as well. There are people who figure out ways to take the methods and also the ethics into different kinds of workplaces and make a case to whatever company that anthropology brings the perspective that that workplace needs. Because those kind of skills about understanding people who are different from you and making good choices based on that, there is no area of human endeavor where that's not relevant. They just don't know it. And so it takes some imagination and it takes some persuasiveness, some like personal skills to make the case for it. But there's also tons of success stories out there.
When you think of people who have anthropology degrees who aren't working in academia or in museum work, most of the time you hear about them working in like HR or international relations, because you have to know people. Like, you have to be able to ask those deep questions on, how to interact with people who are different from you, and being open-minded to the different, traditions and religions that are out there, that you are not the only one. Like, individuals through time and space have made these and created these different cultures based on, where they live and just who they're interacting with.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great segue into one of the publications that you guys had, or a couple of them, was your 2023 publication on anthropology majors prepare for life after college. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was really exciting. We had a grant from the University of Wisconsin Centers for Education Research through a funding opportunity that came up for college to workforce transitions. And I was really interested in this question that we've been talking about with, if you study anthropology, we know that people go on to do cool things, but like, how do you actually navigate that process? And, thinking of it also in an applied frame, what more might we do to make that road a little bit clearer so that people coming into anthropology can have faith that it's taking them somewhere in their lives following graduation. So we got the grant to bring on a cohort of undergraduate student researchers because, for me, hanging around in departments like how do you do fellow undergrads would not really be great field work. But also we thought it would be good to provide this opportunity for, there's a lot of evidence in the higher ed space that having an opportunity to really engage in your discipline as a student they call it a high impact practice is the term. It makes your education more relevant and meaningful to you. And it's something that resonated with me from, different theorists that I had read in grad school about what kind of a thing education is, that it's about like becoming a member of a community. So we wanted to make this opportunity. And the way that it worked, we accepted researchers or research teams from 5 different schools, and they each had a faculty mentor who helped them with the sort of day-to-day questions of how am I doing my data collection? How am I doing my analysis? What are my particular research questions that I'm working on? And like, how am I developing those? And then we would have meetings of the whole group where we would see what's coming out in common from one team to another. And sort of in a bottom-up fashion, we identified some areas of common focus. And then once the initial data collection and analysis was done, the way that we wrote it up was that we had collaborative teams. Every writing team included student researchers from more than one different field site so that they could really work in a comparative way and say, here's what I saw at University of Louisville. Here's what you saw at Illinois State, but they're both talking about some of the same ideas in common. Where the ideas were, it was 4 different papers that they wrote. The first one was, why do students choose to major in anthropology in the first place? And so that's some of what we were talking about a moment ago, about what is it that attracts people to the discipline. Number 2 is, what do they feel like they get out of it in terms of what do they learn and how does it change them? Number 3 is, how do they navigate the question of making the transition out? And number 4 was what supports are available and should be available to them in their department, in their universities, and also maybe from the discipline or from AAA that could help them to do that in a more well-informed way. And then we bracketed it with an introductory paper that I wrote with some colleagues, just explaining what the project was. And then there was a concluding paper where it said, okay, these are student researchers. We've been looking at their research. Let's sort of flip it. And if we look at them as students, what did these researchers learn by participating in this project? And so that came out, last year, 2023, in the Annals of Anthropological Practice.
Yeah, and that's amazing because I spoke with Elizabeth Bryady the other day, and, she was discussing about how she goes into the different universities and their anthropology departments to try and make it better so that while they're teaching theoretical work, they're also teaching methods because we need practical experience before we actually go out into the world. And she even wrote a new book on it. And I think that's really important for anthropology departments to better equip their students because of how, not that it's not well known, but the fact that, when a lot of people meet anthropologists, they're like, what is it that you do? So equipping these students into being like, here are different possible careers that you could go into outside of academia in museum work so that they don't get to the point where they graduate and they no longer have this network or routine and they just have to figure it out on their own. So hopefully that'll be something that anthropology departments in all universities will start to equip their students better.
It's tricky. One of the things that my research team identified, one of their sort of constructs that they came up with was this idea, they called it the inverted funnel, where the idea is that the funnel, if you turn it like right side up, the way you would use a funnel in the kitchen, you pour a lot of different things in and it comes out like directly into a bottle. Right. And so in the metaphor, the funnel looks a little bit like a more professionally oriented undergraduate program. You could think of like a Bachelor of Science in Engineering or a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, where you learn to be an engineer or a nurse, like whatever your background is, you come out sort of formed for this certain kind of a professional application. Compared to in anthropology, flip it upside down, where the small end of the funnel is the group of students who say, what we were talking about, understanding human difference is really inspiring to me, and I want to do that. So that's a very specific thing already to begin with. Right. But the professional applications of it are so broad. You mentioned college teaching, you mentioned museum work. Related to that, you might have different kinds of cultural heritage work, cultural resource management. National Park Service is a huge employer. You can think of all of the anthropologists who work in healthcare in all different ways. The Veterans Administration in the United States employs dozens and dozens of anthropologists across a lot of different sites and facilities. People who work in the tech sector doing user experience research and design. People who work in business doing management consulting. Like all of these are so anthropological. And that's aside from the random weirdo one-offs like anthropologists who would go and work in association management. Like, what the heck even is that? Right. So it's hard for, if you go back to the top of the funnel, for your advisor in undergrad to give you advice, because not just because they don't know, because they're professors themselves and that's their experience, right? Mm-hmm. That's a story that you hear a lot and is part of the problem. But also because there's so much that you could do with it. And, if your advisor says to you, anthropology is great, you can do whatever you want with it, that's not really helpful.
Right.
But it's kind of true. And so what I do is I encourage people to take that as an ethnographic research question. What are the different kinds of jobs that are out there that might be appealing to me, where I might be able to do something that I find engaging, that I can make a difference that I care about, that I feel like I'm making a contribution and that they'll pay me for it. That's a research question. And you have methods.
Yeah.
Have fun.
So for anybody who's getting their PhD or master's thesis, there you go. That's something you can study. Yeah. And then something else that I wanted to discuss with you is you had contributed or helped work on an exhibit. It's called World on the Move, 250,000 Years of Human Migration. What is that?
Our Smithsonian collaborators were Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, which does not have a museum building of its own, but they put the Folklife Festival on the National Mall every summer. They're in charge of the Folkways recording series. And we worked with some of their curators to do this project. And we also worked with Smithsonian Exhibits, which is a Smithsonian unit that does exhibition development and design. Where they were collaborating with us, representing the association, on a traveling exhibition about anthropological and related perspectives on human migration and mobility. It follows on the success of another one that we had 10, 20 years ago. It was called Race, Are We So Different? Where in both of these cases, race and migration are topics that get a lot of attention in current events. But the way that people in sort of public discourse and in media talk about it if you're an anthropologist listening to these conversations, it feels sort of underinformed, maybe under-theorized. For example, one thing that somebody said to us in one of the early brainstorming meetings that we had as we were starting to work on World of the Move, they said, there's a lot of talk about a crisis of undocumented migration. What's a crisis? A crisis is something that's new and bad. Migration is not new. Well, as long as there have been people have been moving all over the surface of the earth. The only thing that's new is the idea that you need official documentation to be allowed to migrate. And that was so mind-blowing for me when that person said it. And it's like, yes, that's that long view and that sort of cross-cultural or like looking from different places in different cases in different kinds of contexts that migration happens. That's what anthropologists can contribute to the discourse. And so we designed and created this traveling exhibition, and it's currently on a tour that's managed by the American Library Association. So it's on a tour of public libraries in the US from 2023 through 2025. Mm-hmm. And then about a year from now, it comes back to us and we're trying to work out what the next phase of its life is going to look like after that. But we've had a lot of really cool success stories from different public libraries all over the United States where it's been sort of in residence for a period of months. And it always gets really great response from the local community, because part of what we wanted to say is that everybody has got like migration stories that they could tell. And, I don't want to say like, oh, I'm doing finger quotes. The United States is a nation of immigrants, because that's problematic. Some people were brought here through enslavement, and that's not really immigration. And some people, indigenous people were here already. Right. And whatever their history might be, erases a lot to say like, oh, we're a nation of immigrants. But there are definitely stories of like, okay, maybe you were here and somebody else arrived. Mm-hmm. What did that look like? Maybe somebody took you from your homeland and brought you here. What did that look like? Maybe not talking about family generations, but when you were a kid, your parents changed jobs and you moved from one city to another. What did that look like? Mm-hmm. And if you take all of these different kinds of stories, it's got some kind of an impact on everyone. And people really appreciate having the opportunity to tell their own story in their own words, right? Like that's another thing that is foundational to anthropology, and bringing that kind of orientation to something that can be a hot button issue, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about your story, and we're talking about these people's stories of all the different folks who are reflected in the content of the exhibition. And it really humanizes it. It makes it not like something scary that's happening at the border, but something that's very personal to all of us.
Yeah, no, I can definitely relate to that, because my dad's side of the family, they are originally from Jamaica. And so they immigrated over to the United States when they were like going into college, high school era. So back in the 70s or 80s, something like that. And then my mom, she was born in Germany, although it was on a U.S. base, and she was considered a U.S. citizen. So they came over here, whereas her mom was like full-blooded German. So her mom came from Germany. So like, what was that experience like for her moving into a new country with a new family? And then just as us kids moving from Colorado to Florida to be closer to family, what was that experience like? So it's kind of like everything that you touched upon, that everybody has their own story of some form of migration. I think what you said was really important. And it's important to humanize this. So it's not just one big issue that's like everybody can relate to this in some form or another.
Yeah. And if anybody listening would like to learn more, the project website is understandingmigration.org. And we've got a ton of resources. You can check it out. And also check the tour schedule. If you're listening to this before August of 2025, you can see if it's coming to a library near you.
I'll have to check it out, because I would love to see something like that. And now, what is the biggest piece of advice that you would give to someone who is graduating with an anthropology degree?
The best advice that I ever got, this was after I had finished my MA, and I had been teaching in these sort of, I talked about community-based nonprofits. It was not great working conditions, although it was really meaningful to the students, and I made some amazing relationships there. But for one reason or another, one group of courses had ended, and this next one was slow to pick up. I wasn't sure where I was going next, and I was thinking about going back to grad school. And I asked a professor who had been my mentor in undergrad about it. And she said, well, grad school is great, but I would encourage you to do like more other stuff first. And that turned out to be really foundational for me. The story that I told up top about how the question that came to me in my high school teaching days turned into my PhD thesis when the time came. I think that gave me like a reason to be in grad school, is that I was interested in these questions about language and culture and education. And I was learning how to do that thing rather than just like, I'm still in school because I'm good at school and I like school and it feels safe to me. And I'm interested in it and I want to learn more about it. That shift that we were talking about, where you're like sort of becoming less of a student and more of a colleague to your professors, more of like already doing an academic job, you need to be developing what your research program would be. And for me, the way that I did it was by questions that I had brought with me from my previous career. Obviously, there's tons of ways to do it. And there's a lot of people who do go straight from undergrad into PhD programs and have enormously successful careers doing whatever, although tenure lines are harder to come by now than ever. So I would say you owe it to yourself to go in aware of that and make an informed consent to living the academic life for as long as you're in it. But the other thing that I had learned from that experience, aside from like having research questions for me, is that you become less and less closely supervised the farther on you go. My daughter's in 8th grade right now. She's just starting her 8th grade year. And it's been a real shock to her just in the first couple of weeks that there's so much more homework for her in 8th grade than in 7th grade. And I said to her, I stayed in school basically as long as one can stay in school. And the trend as you go through is that more and more of the work you do on your own time, to the point where if you choose to go as far as a PhD, you are working 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 hours a week writing. And you meet with your advisor every 2, 3, 4 weeks. And the rest of it, it's on you to make whatever structure you need. And I feel like coming out of a professional environment had its pluses and minuses there, where it was, on the one hand, it was like being graded again was really jarring for me. It's like, what does this mean and why do I care about it? That you're giving me like an A versus an A minus, especially when I was being graded by TAs, because it's like, is this a performance review from my colleague or what? But the real positive of coming out of a professional career back into a PhD program was that I had developed like habits and strategies for keeping myself accountable, because I would show up to teach at 7:30 and there would be a room full of kids and I would need to have something for them one way or another. And so I knew how to do that. I knew how to keep myself going. I knew how to like work to timelines and get my grades in and plan out lessons ahead of time so that I would be ready, to the point where when I was then moving on to grad school, if it reached a point where I was like overwhelmed with schoolwork, it felt luxurious that like, if I just don't get everything done, I'm the only one that has any kind of negative consequences for that. It's not like my colleague is waiting on me to make a thing and pass it off to them so that the project can get completed. It's not like my students are going to show up and need something to do. It's just like, okay, maybe I get a B. Right. So what?
And that's the other thing about some people really love school. So going from bachelor's to master's to PhD and being in school for that long, some people love it. They're like, I just love learning so much that this is no issue for me. But then you have those individuals like me, and I'm just like, no, I finished my bachelor's and I am good. Like the only way I'll go back is if someone's paying for my master's.
I would also say that like going to grad school, going to a PhD program because you love learning, it's like going to library school because you love to read, right? Like that's not what librarians do.
Because you focus on one little niche thing on your PhD. So it's not like you're getting this broad spectrum that you were when you were getting your bachelor's.
And it's also the kind of thing, like I've read about professional crossword puzzlers, right? How do you get into professional like competitive professional crossword puzzles? Where sometimes people say like, no, I tried it and I don't want to do it because it takes all the joy out of it when it becomes a job.
Yep.
Right? There's all kinds of ways that you can learn. If you love learning, go take piano lessons. There's all kinds of things that you can learn in your life. PhD school is a job. And I think you owe it to yourself. I found it to be a really great job. I kind of loved it. Your mileage may vary. A lot of people don't have that experience. But I would say you owe it to yourself to do your due diligence in advance and know, like, what is that job? And also because it's a limited term job, right? It's kind of a long-term temp job. What are you going to do after? And if I were, I read a column by a history professor who said, when my advisees come to me and they say they want to apply to PhD programs, I say, I will gladly write you a letter. You have to tell me 2 different jobs that you could get after you finish that you'd be interested in. Because one of them is probably going to be, I want what you have. And that's nice if you can get it. What if you can't? What else might you do? And that's a question that pushes people to explore some of those alternatives that we were talking about and learn about what else is out there. Right.
That's very important because, you go through all the schooling in America. I don't know how it is in other countries, but schooling higher education is very expensive. So if you can't get a job that's going to be able to, like if you have any student loans or debt, if you're not able to find a job right out of getting your degree, especially one that's going to be high enough that's going to pay for that, you're putting yourself in a hole and in a financial constraint that you're probably going to be in for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So you have to make sure it's worth it.
And even if you're in a PhD that's funded.
Yeah.
Maybe you're not paying tuition, but yeah, you're making peanuts, and then you're 30, 35 years old and your last salary was $20,000 and they set your next salary based on your last salary. So
right. Exactly. Now, is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you would like to discuss before we get to our final 3 questions?
I love that question. What did we not talk about that you wanted to talk about? Someone once told me you always end an interview that way. And so I love you bringing your field methods to this. No, I didn't really have anything something burning that I wanted to get on record. So
Okay.
I'm ready to move on if you are.
Yeah. So the first question is, what changes do you wish to see among the association space?
We were talking before about what that anthropological perspective gives you of like having understood how different cultures function. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what I do now in my current role is about if we're trying to do things differently as an association, who's going to like it and who's not going to like it? And how do we talk to them in ways that they can feel like we relate to them? A question that I find to be, it's been sort of on my mind a lot lately as like of scholarly and professional interest is a lot of the time when you are in a leadership position in a complex organization, you have to make decisions that some people will be happy with your decision and some people will not. How can you keep people as members of your community, even if they don't get their way? How can they not get their way and be okay with it? Or if they're not okay with it, at least it's not a deal breaker. And they say, forget it, I'm gone now. And my working hypothesis is that it has to do with agency. It has to do with feeling heard, right? What kills us is not, I didn't get my way. What kills us is, why wasn't I consulted? And I guess what I would say, my vision for association space is to be able to bring those kinds of anthropological insights in and really thinking of what is it to be a community manager? What do we know from our study of around the world and throughout history? How do communities actually function? And what insights do we have that we can apply to do our job better?
That's a good one. And the next question, what do you absolutely love about your job or the industry that you work in?
What do I love about my job? I remember when I was just coming into academic linguistics as a prospective grad student, thinking a lot about like, wow, I'm meeting these professors and these people are world-class experts on talk and interaction, and they are not good at talking and interacting like as humans. What is the deal? And somebody said to me, well, if they could do it, they wouldn't need to study it. And I feel like I'm kind of that way about communities, right? It's like I've always been kind of an awkward person in a lot of ways and like very much in my head. And I think that being able to take a community as an object of scholarly interest, but also like take those scholarly insights and make a difference in people's lives, that's what interests me about nonprofit management, right? Because you need to really understand like who your people are, what do they need, what does one group of people need, what does another group of people need that might feel like a conflict. How can we bring people into alignment? How can we orient them to a larger mission? Why are they here in the first place? And how can we make this experience of being here something that's rewarding for them and that is in line with their values, right? That's exciting to me to be able to do those things. And so that's why I like association work. That's
great. And the final question, where can listeners learn more about you and your work?
So the association website is americananthro.org. The World on the Move, you mentioned their website is understandingmigration.org. Other than that, if you have specific questions, you can email me.
Well, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
I appreciate you reaching out. I'm always glad to, if part of my job is raising the profile and everybody likes to talk about themselves. So I'm thankful for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Anthropuzzled. This show was produced by me. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website and episode descriptions, and to Leah Akers for the incredible logo design. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound of Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letsinger@anthropuzzle.com. That's abby.letsinger@anthropuzzle.com. Or as Anthropuzzled on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, and TikTok. Until next time.